I think we could probably, no, it's still one minute if we want to be precise. Okay. Okay, so I could probably go ahead with this very short, concise introduction to our final keynote. So I'm really honored and delighted to welcome everyone to our keynote to the 80th International Scientific Conference, University of Latvia, Cognitive Science session. And I'm honored because of our speaker, Nora Newcombe, was not only one of my research heroes, but has established the whole field of spatial cognition in respect to development. I cannot think of someone who has done more significant work in terms of developmental changes, developmental effects of spatial factors on learning, and therefore I'm so glad that Nora is with us today. Nora is a Laura Carnell Professor of Psychology at Temple University. She's also president of International Mind-Brain Education Society and past president of the Federation of Associations in Brain Behavioral Sciences. She's also editor of Psychological Science in Public Interest, and I think is also represented numerous high-ranking journals, and Nora Newcombe is also William James Fellow, which is I would say the same as Fields Medal in computer science and mathematics. Therefore, also on behalf of the University of Latvia and the Faculty of Computing, we are of course very honored. There are many contributions in the fields of developmental psychology, cognitive science in both general terms, but also in spatial cognition. And without saying more, I would be delighted to give the floor to Professor Nora Newcombe.
Oh, thank you so much. It was my pleasure to visit Riga. At this point, it's quite a few years ago, and I just hope that at some point I'll have the repeat pleasure. We keep talking about it, but it never quite seems like it's going to be the right, time. But sooner or later, something will happen, I hope. Okay, so I want to talk today about spatial thinking and its relationship to science, to math, to thinking in those fields. And you can see from the pictures that I have here of someone looking at a molecule, doing some kind of chemistry, and some geologists or geology students on a field trip looking at fault lines and drawing them and thinking about what those lines tell you about the history of the Earth and what's behind that cliff face and so forth. You get a sense of how many scientific problems are spatial. And this is true also for children and also in mathematics. For instance, the kinds of spatial relationships that you're using when you use an abacus is a nice example. But these kinds of examples are what psychologists call face validity. It sort of seems like there's spatial thinking in science and spatial thinking in math for children and for adults. But what we need to do, and this will be my first theme, if we're scientists, is to show that that intuition about the relationship is really correct. So I'll begin by arguing that we have evidence that spatial thinking is important in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematical STEM disciplines. Then I'll get to my second point, which is that spatial thinking is malleable. That is, we can change it. If it were just the case that some people can engage well in this kind of thinking and other people have more trouble, and that's kind of a fixed characteristic of people, it would be interesting, but it would be less important for education, for policy. But in fact, we do have evidence that if you're not so good, you can get better. And even if you're pretty good, you can still get better. So then I want to move to my third point, which kind of has two parts. Many people who hear about the evidence for the first two ideas will really go to, well, then we should improve individual learners' spatial skills. We should do interventions, maybe play-based with toddlers, maybe workbook-based with university students to improve their spatial skills. So I'll review the evidence for that approach. But then I also want to turn to the idea that we can infuse tools that facilitate spatial thinking, that support spatial thinking, that are tools for spatial thinking in the actual curriculum. So it doesn't have to be a separate standalone endeavor. Okay, I'll first improve your spatial skills, then you can learn geology or chemistry or math or whatever. But instead, it's really infused through all of those courses. So the first point about the relationship empirically between spatial thinking and STEM outcomes comes from a paper that is more than a decade old now, which is based on a longitudinal study that was done in the United States, beginning with high school students in the early 1960s. And they were tested for their verbal, their mathematical, and their spatial skills. And they were followed up to see what disciplines they went into when they were adults, what their occupations were. And what we have here is a graph that shows for each discipline how their spatial skills compare to the sample as a whole, controlling statistically for their verbal and for their mathematical skills, because those do tend to all go together. So we control out those skills and look at spatial. And when the bars go right, we see that people in those occupations have higher than usual for the sample spatial skills. And when they go left, they have somewhat lower. So you do see at the bottom that engineering, math and computer science, physical science are quite high as high school students. So this is a longitudinal kind of predictive correlation. We also see that there are lower than normal for the sample scores for education and for law. Now, is this also true in childhood? And I'll tell you about a few studies that suggest that it is. This relationship is from actually two longitudinal studies that were done from the ages of 5 to the ages of 8, using a test of spatial skill given at age 5, which is something where you have to take these patterns and either slide them together, slide them vertically together, tilt them, or tilt and slide them, and pick out which of those figures at the top you would make if you did those operations. And then at age 6, the children were asked to place a number on a number line. And then at age 8, they were given a test of approximate mathematics. So you just have to imagine things going into chess, and 5 go in and 8 go in, and how many. And even if you don't say 13, the important thing is sort of that you don't say 20. And what we see here, controlling for vocabulary. So again, we're controlling out sort of general intelligence and verbal intelligence in particular. Spatial skill at age 5 does relate to this calculation measure 3 years later. And furthermore, you begin to get an idea of what the mechanism might be, because spatial skill relates to the number line placements, which in turn relates to the approximate symbolic calculation. And once you do that, the direct relationship that used to be significant drops out. So this gives a sense that one of the reasons for the relationship might be the ability to visualize or spatialize quantity and to array it along a number line. This kind of study was done a couple of years later in Switzerland, starting with basically 5 years of age, kindergarten, and ending just 2 years later with grade 2. And Andrea Frick used a much larger array of spatial tests. So what we have here, a mental rotation we call the ghost task, which of these ghosts would fit in this puzzle hole. A test of perspective taking, if this little guy were taking a photo from his or her vantage point of those shapes, what would the photo look like? A test of two-dimensional line drawing to sort of it's two-dimensional, but it has depth information and color and so forth. The ability to use diagrams. This one is a test of spatial assembly, and then a scaling test where if this little tiny chicken hides an egg in this tiny, tiny little garden space, where is the egg in the larger garden space? And I won't take you through all of these relationships, but what this is telling us is that the kindergarten spatial skills on all of these various tests predict various aspects of math at grade 2. So, you know, sometimes people say, well, what is spatial skill? Is one test better than another? I think we haven't quite teased that out, but they all seem to be doing some work for us in this longitudinal study and to be relating to each other in sensible ways to form factors. Now, we took this kind of approach to preschool also. We devised a way to assess preschool spatial ability by asking 3-year-olds to copy either flat designs, and they got more and more complicated, and we have a scoring system for it, or to copy 3-dimensional block designs. And again, they get more and more complicated, and we score it. And we call this the test of spatial assembly, the TOSA, and that's at age 3. We also assess vocabulary with the Peabody picture vocabulary test, and math at age 3, which are some very simple math tests like how high they can count. And then at age 4, we did a test of executive functioning, which involved tapping measure and the ability to inhibit tapping. And with all these variables in the sort of mix with predicting age 5 math outcomes down here in sort of purplish, and also age 5 spatial outcomes, what we see is that the TOSA at 3 predicts the spatial at age 5, and that's defined by the test that I showed you before for age 5, where you slide the various shapes. That's with vocabulary and executive function in the picture. Executive function does relate to math. Vocabulary does not relate to math with all these other things in the picture. Math predicts math, but what's most interesting to us is this concurrent same age relationship between spatial at age 5 and math at age 5, because there's continuity in the spatial. So this spatial is predicting age 5 math because it predicts age 5 spatial. The last thing I want to take you through along these lines takes us back to high school, well, to elementary school, but then high school and college and occupational outcomes. So this is a really recent analysis that we did of another longitudinal database gathered in the United States, actually originally to look at the effects of early childcare on outcomes, but it had a measure of spatial thinking at grade 4, which is about 9 years old. And this was taken from the Wechsler intelligence test. It's the block design test, where you have to look at a design and assemble the design using your own blocks. And here's a few results. First of all, in terms of predicting going into STEM, this is these are the college majors of the children that were assessed at age 4. And what you can see for both women and for men is that the non-STEM majors have the lowest scores on the block design test. The people in the non-math intensive STEM disciplines, like actually biology is less math intensive, are intermediate, and then the math intensive are the highest. You also see a sex difference, right? Like the math intensive STEM women are lower than the math intensive STEM men, but they're still doing math intensive majors. You can also see the effect size for the spatial difference at age 4, which is small. On block design, it was only about 1/4 of a standard deviation. Plus, you also see the really, really large overlap between the women and the men. And then the last result that I'm sharing with you from this study shows that in terms of sex differences, the prediction, these are actually all significant because it's a sizable sample. There's, I think, something like close to 700, 670 or something people in this, that gender does affect the block design scores at age 9, which in turn affects your choice of STEM major. And the sex difference in women going less into STEM is fully accounted for by this early spatial difference. So here we see that the first proposition is true in these longitudinal designs, that there's a predictive relationship accounting for other factors that sort of runs from preschool through adulthood, and that also accounts, at least in part, for the sex difference in going into math-intensive STEM fields. So I also want to say there's another kind of evidence other than this longitudinal evidence, which comes from neuroscience. You know, 5 or 6 years ago, Stan Dehaene, and working with a woman who's actually a mathematician, but who also does cognitive neuroscience, studied expert mathematicians and gave them both math problems and verbal problems to do in the scanner, which some of them made sense, some of them didn't make sense. They were from a variety of areas of math, not just geometry, but algebra, etc. Also gave these problems to people who had PhDs, but not in math, and studied their brains while they looked at these problems. And I don't want to take you through all the little brain maps in detail, because the bottom line is that the mathematicians use spatial areas of the brain to solve math. The mathematical judgments were related to these spatial areas. The evidence suggests that high-level mathematical expertise and basic number sense share common roots in what they call a non-linguistic brain circuit, but it's basically a spatial brain circuit. So let's move to the second point, which is that spatial thinking can change. And this is harking back to a meta-analysis, a quantitative review of studies of training and education in this area, that I did with David Utall and a host of other folks, we grouped the literature into 5 different kinds of spatial thinking or spatial skills, including, a very familiar one, mental rotation, perspective taking, like the little person with a camera taking a photo from a different vantage point. Disembedding is trying to see a design in a nest of different lines. And what you can see here is that we got moderate to large training effects. They're all significantly different from 0. The smallest one for disembedding is a little over 1/3 of a standard deviation. The largest one for spatial perception, which is the ability to draw horizontal and vertical lines relative to gravity, as in Piaget's water level task, that trains awfully well. That's about 2/3 of a standard deviation. And we also found that these effects of training last at least for 3 to 4 months, which is as long as people had really tried to push it, and that there's transfer, at least moderate transfer, for instance, from mental rotation to folding up a piece of paper to form something 3-dimensional and back. So that kind of transfer we also got. So this kind of demonstration is what leads a lot of people to think in terms of training individual spatial skills. This is the approach taken, for instance, by Cheryl Sorby when she took engineering students who tested low on spatial skills, many of whom were women, gave them a whole workbook to improve their spatial skills, and found that they do better in their engineering course subsequently. And the meta-analysis does suggest that if you can shift to the right the normal distribution of spatial skill by as much as we know from the meta-analysis that you can shift it to the right, and then you take the cutoff that we know from the study I told you about, the earliest, the one of American teenagers done in the 60s, and then they were followed up. You would find in light gray the proportion of people who had the spatial skills to become engineers before training, without training. But in dark gray, you see the numbers of people who would be moved up to a position where they could successfully do an engineering degree with training. So that's pretty encouraging, and lots of people like that workbook approach or that training approach. I think we do need to know a little bit more about how long it lasts, how far it transfers. Also, a lot of people are surprised to know that in our meta-analysis, we did not find any evidence that children could improve more than adults, or vice versa. A lot of people think, oh, you should start in childhood. That would be important. Children are so plastic, so malleable. We didn't find that. It could be that with better training methods, children would show larger effects, but we didn't find it. People also often hope that they can narrow a gender difference with training, that women would catch up to men. And we didn't find that in our meta-analysis either. Instead, what seemed to happen is that the men improve and the women improve, but the women don't catch up because the men are improving too. But it might be true that with longer training, the women would catch up because the men would reach kind of asymptote, the limits of their ability. And of course, all of this is relative to how we've trained. I mean, there might be better methods of training. Maybe we need to do it longer or more intensively or differently or tailored to little kids versus adults or to women. And we also haven't done any real training of navigation. Everything is small scale spatial skills, thinking about rotation. The closest we come is those perspective taking tasks, but that's not really navigation. So I think there's a lot left to be done. But if you do improve, what is the evidence for, if you can improve spatial skills, do you really improve STEM? So far, I just told you about malleability and the promise of the individual approach. When you take the individual approach, does it actually work? And there were some studies, some of them really old, like the Small and Morton 1983, that did suggest that you could improve chemistry, geoscience, physics, and calculus with Cheryl Sorby's workbook approach. And then in 2017, I reviewed some studies of children as well as adults, science and math, and found some, I think, promising effects. It wasn't a quantitative meta-analysis, though. So what I want to tell you about is a meta-analysis that just came out. The literature is ripe enough that it could be meta-analyzed, done by Zach Hawes, Katie Gilligan-Lee, and Kelly Nix, which focuses on children and focuses on math. So they were able to find 29 studies that among them had 89 mathematics outcomes of spatial training and close to 4,000 participants. They basically replicated the Utah et al. Meta-analysis by finding that there is indeed an effect of spatial training on spatial reasoning, overall about a half a standard deviation. So, and this is a set of studies that we had not meta-analyzed. So it's a bona fide replication. Now, when we turn to the important effect, spatial training on math outcomes, they found a significant meta-analytic effect, but it's on the small side. It's about 1/4 of a standard deviation. Now, they also found, though, they tested a lot of moderators, and they did not find that any of them really had an impact except for age. If you look at this chart, you see that the effect size of spatial training on math outcomes at these preschool, kindergarten type ages is effectively 0. But that by the time you get up to age sort of 15, 20, you have really sizable effects, more of the 2/3, standard deviation level. You also, though, see a lot of scatter. I mean, here are 2 studies, one of which is with children maybe around 7 that showed an effect on math of over a standard deviation. We have one study down here of 4-year-olds that actually had a negative effect. I know which study this is. I think it was, first of all, way too kind of heavy-handed rote drill for 4-year-olds. They probably phased out. And it also was with a comparison group of 4-year-olds who had actual math training affecting math outcomes. So it's negative with respect to if you train math, you train math, which I kind of think is slightly unfair. But we have to get a better handle on what the scatter is about before we just conclude, forget about little kids, let's train spatial skills at the older age ranges. They have a long discussion of whether 1/4 of a standard deviation is worth it, in which they argue that it's actually as good or better than lots of educational interventions. So, and I think that's a fair argument. So on the whole, I'm encouraged that the approach of training individual skills has real promise. I do think we need to look more at science outcomes, and some of that work is in progress. There was enough work on math for them to do the meta-analysis, but right now there isn't enough on science, I don't think. And we really do have to think more about experts in pedagogy developing age-appropriate techniques. So that's in line with my critique of that study of the 4-year-olds. And there's a guy called Tom Lowry, who I visited before the pandemic, obviously, in Australia, who is really a very gifted designer of programs. And he has some large grants to do things on like ELSA, Early Learning STEM Australia. So I think that's going to be really important as we develop these ideas. And we do really have to think about how long and what the transfer looks like. In the meta-analysis, Zach Hawes and his group, didn't find that how long you did the spatial training actually mattered. But that is so counterintuitive that there's a part of me that just does not believe it. So we need to look a little bit more at that. But in the last part of the talk, I want to focus on a different approach than training individual spatial skills, because I think it has some strengths that are often neglected. A notable one is that the school day is really crowded. There's a lot to do in the school day. And, you know, we don't want to get rid of music or art or recess or gym or some of the things that people sometimes say, oh, they should only be doing academics. We don't want to get rid of academics. They still need to learn math and science and how to read with skill and how to write and so forth. So if you, this is a word that people have invented recently, spatializing the curriculum, make the curriculum spatial. It will fit better in the crowded school day. It may well also improve individual spatial skills. So this is a somewhat indirect way of improving the individual spatial skills, but it might work. And it's actually what was recommended 15, 16 years ago in a report from the National Academy of Sciences here in the US called Learning to Think Spatially. But what does it mean? And so here I want to go through what in the Spatial Intelligence and Learning Center we started to call spatial tools. This was a Science of Learning Center that was funded here in the US that I headed from 2006 to 2018. So one kind of tool are human devised symbolic systems. Language. Here are some words that we took from a curriculum recommendation for middle school, and we kind of are highlighting some of the spatial terms like surface and motion and so forth, region. And learning to use these terms is, I'll tell you more in a few minutes, not only important in its own right, but seems to affect and interact with spatial thinking. Maps, this is the Grand Canyon, this is a map of the Grand Canyon. So thinking in maps tells you not only where to go to get to the skywalk, but lots of things, especially if you have an elevation map, which I'm not showing here, about how the Grand Canyon is organized and why you might not want to hike straight across it, and so on. And then there's diagrams that abstract out what a fault might look like and what the forces are. And I'm not showing graphs, but graphs. So how does spatial language affect spatial thinking? And you know, how does it also affect STEM outcomes? But here what I'm looking at is an analysis done of preschoolers in which from another longitudinal database, they found that parent spatial language is related to children's spatial thinking. That's again on the test of sliding those forms around. So if parents use more spatial language, the children do better on that test. And maybe that's because they are learning to think spatially, but also to talk spatially. So the parent's spatial language influences the children learning the spatial language, which seems pretty straightforward. And that in turn relates to the children's ability to do the test. So when you think about spatial skills, people often, when they're solving jigsaw puzzles, they talk about, oh, look for ones with a flat edge, look for the corner, look for the one that has, you know, some jagged bits in orange. They use words like that when you're filling in one of these things that goes from larger to smaller. You talk a lot about larger and smaller. So spatial words can flag what you're supposed to do on these spatial tasks. Turning to maps and turning to much older people, now I'm back in high school with seniors, 16, 17-year-olds, and looking not just at ordinary maps, but at GIS, Geographic Information Systems, in which you layer various maps one on the other. So you might have a map of where various kinds of customers are, that layers onto where they're living, that layers onto maybe elevation or land use or just the real world, to try to think about if you want to open a bar, you might want to go to an area in the city that's crowded with young folks who might want to go to a bar. It's actually, GIS is used a lot in commercial decisions. But if you offer a course to high school students, high school seniors, and this is a semester-long course, so it's a 4-month or so course in which they learn how to use GIS and to use GIS to think about spatial problems. What effect does that have on their spatial thinking, on their STEM learning subsequently, and so forth? So here what I'm showing you are some of their, one of their projects. This is called Barely Relocated. Some of this coursework was pioneered in Virginia, and actually the western part, but not West Virginia, the western part of the state of Virginia, which has mountains and national parks, and sometimes bears wander into populated areas. And so this student thought about how to help the National Park Service relocate those bears. So, you shoot them with a dart and you make them go to sleep, because who wants to do anything with a live bear? But then you have to load them in a truck, and take them somewhere where they can survive, where the truck can go, where it's far enough that they're not going to get back into town. And that's a spatial problem. It has to be far enough away, but with a road and with a habitat that is favorable to bears. And you can solve that problem using GIS. So that was this student's project. So how do we know if it worked? Well, this is one way, and this project now has actually gone to other methods that I won't tell you about, including looking at neural changes in the brain. But this is one, I think, cute way of assessing the effect of the program. They gave them actual verbal problems, like if you were running a campaign to win a vote, or if your city needed to add a landfill, how would you decide? And what they found is that the GIS students, maybe not surprisingly, came up with a lot of spatial solutions about maps and data, plotting, and those kind of words, which are in line with really good science and engineering practices. And a comparison group of students who took an advanced placement course. So, just to control, because the geospatial semester kids were pretty smart and the advanced placement students are pretty smart. So it's not random assignment, but these pretty smart kids found that although they didn't differ in their use of spatial words, back to language, before they took their courses, the geospatial semester students used a lot more spatial words later. So they were starting to think spatially using spatial language. The advanced placement students actually declined slightly, but whatever. So here's another tool, which is gesture. And Susan Golden Meadow, who was an active participant in co-PI in Silk, has obviously, many of you have heard of her, done a ton of work on gesture. And some of it concerns science and math problems. I'll just tell you about one study that was spearheaded by Miriam Novak that involved about 9-year-olds solving these kind of missing add-in problems. So if 2 + 9 + 4 equals something plus 4, you all know the correct answer is 11. But fourth graders often say either 15, partly because they interpret, this is the problem with it, interpreting the equal sign is just we'll add up everything on the left, that's the answer. Sometimes they even say 19 because they just add up everything, which is basically even worse error. But what you want them to do is to concentrate on the 2 + 9. So what they tried to do is to do it with this kind of B gesture. You point to the 2 + 9, then you point to the blank, and you also point to the 4 and point to the 4, and you concretely give an idea of this kind of equivalence. They accompanied all of these various kinds of actions, concrete gestures, abstract gestures. I showed you the abstract gestures with the same kind of linguistic description. And what they found was these abstract gestures really helped the kids not only to learn, which the concrete gestures help too, but really to transfer. So the abstract gesture in the dark gray here on the far transfer is by far the best. It's equal to the concrete gesture on the near transfer. It's actually a little worse just in training per se, but it buys you this far transfer, which is really, really encouraging. This is another study of gesture done at the University of Chicago with a Silk collaborator, C.N. Beilock. And this is a study involving university students and involving physics, in which you're learning about momentum and rotational momentum, and you're holding 2 bicycle wheels, which are joined with a stick, and they're either going in the same direction or one is they're going in opposite directions, which is really hard to gesture. And if they're going in opposite directions, there's a kick. So it's hard to keep it upright. And their task is to keep a laser pointer aligned with a vertical line on the wall, which is much easier when the wheels are going in the same direction. There's an observer who observes the person doing this. So they see it, they think about it, they just don't feel it. So this is also, it's about embodied cognition, which it's sort of gesture, but it's gesture is embodied, but also symbolic. This is almost purely embodied more than it is gesture. And what they found was, this is plotted, so it looks small, but it's significant. These error bars do not overlap, that on a post-test, the people who had felt the kick did better. And this is in a real-world classroom on a real-world test. So back to gesture, like not embodied cognition exactly, gesture, symbols, but yoking this with maps. So you don't have to think about using one technique just on its own. You know, sort of use techniques together. This is an elevation map, and of course the lines join areas of the same height. And so people who read these maps a lot tell me they get kind of pop-out effects. So Lake of the Ozarks, there on the left, that's sort of skinny and turning. They see low in blue, and then these other areas that are, you know, higher, where you get these concentric circles. They see them as high, but most of us don't really see them that way. And students, in fact, struggle with how to interpret topographic maps, which is a problem if you're a hiker, but it's also a problem if you're a student in geology. And so the first step in our studying this was actually to come up with a way to quantitatively assess how good they were at reading topographic maps, which we did. And then we used models to build up what those maps were really showing people. And we used gestures to indicate hills and valleys and so forth. And we contrasted that with a simpler intervention in which you point at the line and trace it and say, you know, oh, this is the same elevation, you know. So you're learning the convention of the map. What we actually found, a little to our surprise, was that the pointing and tracing here in purple is really the best. The gesture with the models was second, text-based instruction was third, and then no instruction at all is sort of the baseline, and it's the lowest. But actually, the only significant difference is that the point and trace beat no instruction. In subsequent work, what we're converging on is the idea that point and trace teaches you the convention of the map, and then subsequently, the gestures and the models help you to go beyond that. But I include that basically to tell you that these things don't always work. You have to really tease apart what to do when and how to sequence them. Another technique is sketching, which is you creating a diagram, and you often talk aloud as you do it. And lots of people think this is a really great way to learn science. And it is true that people who are experts draw diagrams differently. If they look at this kind of a diagram, a novice will concentrate on these unimportant details, like it doesn't matter about the cloud if you're thinking about the volcano. Whereas the expert is drawing something much more schematic, but you'll note there are arrows that really pick out, you know, the crucial things. So they've concentrated on the arrows in the diagram. So the lesson here is that diagrams are not just pictures. You don't just look at them and know what you're supposed to be thinking about. You're supposed to be concentrating on certain things. So you should teach people how to read diagrams. And then when they sketch, you can evaluate those sketches. And one of the things we did in Silk was to come up with some sketch worksheets that were linked to the geoscience curriculum in university and that could be automatically scored. So again, sketching as a spatial learning mechanism, does it work? Kristen Gagne in one study found that it does work. She had coupled it though with you make a prediction as you sketch, and the pre-post is significant. If you just visualize but you don't sketch, there's no improvement. Copying, no improvement. So predicting, sketching is helpful. But in another study done with Dana Miller-Cotto, with students who are in what we call middle school, so they're about 11, 12, 13, we actually did not find a significant effect of sketching. And in fact, if we were also asking the students to self-explain, to talk out loud, they declined if they also had to sketch, maybe because they were just being asked to do too much. The only significant effect here is that if you don't ask them to sketch, self-explanation is better than if you don't ask them to explain the problem out loud, which is a pretty well-known effect. So I do want to say that all of these tools I think are helpful, but we are going to have to work out in some detail what to do, how, with whom, in what sequence. Here, we think that you have to train students ahead of time in what we mean by sketching, and help them to learn not to sketch those seductive details like the clouds. So yet another mechanism is analogy. Deidre Gentner, who studies analogy, was my co-PI in Silk. And of course, she has done tons of research on analogy. And this is a study, very brief intervention that they did in the Chicago Children's Museum, where these skyscrapers built out of building materials are shown to young kids, either aligned, you see there in the lower left, in a way that allows you to focus on the fact that one has a diagonal brace, or not aligned, and then you don't really see that there's the difference. All the kids are asked to do is shake the skyscrapers and say which is the shakiest. And then an hour or so later, they're asked with a different kind of task where they have to repair the shaky skyscraper. How do you do it? Whether they learned the diagonal brace principle. And what you see is that in red, the highly aligned, the kids who saw and shook the highly aligned structures seem to have learned the diagonal brace principle. And here we have analogy at the algebra learning level combined with gesture, where a teacher is using her hands to draw analogies between one math problem and another math problem. And what this team found is that it's important for the problems to be all visible. Sequential visualization, write it on the board and rub it out. No, don't do that. Have them both up. They should both be visible. And then you can compare, and then you really get some learning effects. This is taken from a Cognitive Principles book that was developed for training US teachers, in which it's recommended that analogies need to be elaborated on to direct student attention to the crucial similarities and what's to be learned. So I think I'm going to skip this last set of slides and the last study and just go directly to your questions. We have, I don't know if you just go for the hour. We have at least 9 minutes for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people, and I see a question.
Thanks, Nora. So that was really awesome. And well, the first question is by Ivar Sausers from psychology.
Yeah. I was really happy to listen. Thank you very, very much. I had basically two questions which popped up into my mind when I was listening. The first one was regarding how spatial cognition correlates to, let's say, more applied mathematical thinking, like being able to ride a motorcycle either in a risky or in a less risky way. That could be one example, or maybe another kind of applied mathematics regarding one's investments, financial investments. That's the first question. And then the second one regarding art students, they have a kind of curriculum for spatial thinking, I suppose, when they have to draw or to paint, or maybe to develop their skills of sculpting something. Yeah, what would be your answers? Thank you.
So I actually hear that as three questions. So the first one was about, in my mind, sensory motor. So the motorbike tilting, or the just bicycle tilting, or people also often ask about sports, throwing and catching and so forth, or reading the field, those kinds of things. Reading the field might be different, but anything that's sensory motor, I think, is distinct. It's not what I think of as spatial cognition. It's procedural knowledge. And there actually is quite a lot of research from people who study perception and action on things like throwing and catching that shows that they don't compute. You can never compute fast enough to know where to go to catch. And instead, it's very much a perception, action, sensory motor kind of linkage. So I would say no to that first one. The second one, investments, well, that's highly symbolic and basically mathematical. And so for that one, I would say absolutely yes. And this is where I probably shouldn't have skipped what we've done about scaling of large magnitudes, because people are very bad at thinking about either large or small space or large, long or short time. But they can be trained or supported to be better at that. Now, of course, investment, there's also a lot of emotion, so spatial isn't going to help you with that. But I do think spatial thinking can help you with, you know, ideas like compound interest. So yes to that. And then you asked me about art. And I didn't flag it on one of those very early slides that I showed of high school students and what occupations they went into. But visual art is also high in spatial skill in high school, unsurprisingly. And I do think that an arts curriculum, visual arts curriculum, has a lot of promise as a method of helping for people who are so inclined, and including sort of crafts. So, you know, there's actually a grad student here who is interested in things like knitting and weaving and crocheting. And those sorts of crafts have the virtue of being female sex type, not male sex type. So that might be a way to improve spatial thinking in women without saying, okay, fine, you have to, you know, build a model airplane or something. Yeah, I like model airplanes. So, yeah.
Thanks indeed.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. We have time for other questions or comments. Are there any other questions, comments?
I'm sorry, I cannot raise my hand here, but I have a question. I'm also very happy to have a chance to listen to your presentation, which is really interesting. And I have a question about the spatial skills if we could train. Could be there some subjects or fields where that is a disadvantage to like improve these skills?
Sorry, what subject?
Could be there some fields what the students have to learn, or just in general for people where the higher spatial skills would be disadvantage. Maybe there are some fields where it's okay.
Oh, would it be at a disadvantage?
Yeah.
Is that the question? Oh, that's so interesting. Well, I don't know if you're positively at a disadvantage. Say, going back to that first chart where you saw the lawyers going to the left. Is it actually bad to be a lawyer who thinks spatially? I don't know if it's bad. It's just that the law is so verbal, and it's so much about writing arguments and speaking about arguments that maybe it's a problem to not, you can't develop everything is what I'm trying to say. That from the point of view of the time investment to get good at something, you might not really be able to get as good at something that isn't directly relevant to your discipline. But even there, you know, sometimes when you watch a courtroom, there are like there've been a few high-profile cases recently in the United States involving people sadly shooting each other, including, and you know, sometimes it's policemen engaged in these acts and so forth. And they have these exhibits where they show, you know, standing here, this is what you could have shot. No, you couldn't have shot. You wouldn't have a line of sight, whatever. And those are sometimes, I think, not as effective as they could be. So I'm not completely sure that it's irrelevant to law, but yeah, I'd have to think more about where it's bad.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? I have a small question. I probably, in general, I think the whole idea that, let's say, the STEM fields are in terms of learning are increased in quality if you have better set of spatial abilities, but the STEM fields are very different. They can be very different if we compare chemistry, math, medical science. So my question is, are there any factors that are more sensitive, let's say, for medical science, or other factors for for chemistry, and then still something else for math?
Yeah. So we have tried to do a little bit of work on this. My colleague Tim Shipley is probably the leader there, where there's certain kinds of spatial transformations that he focused on geology, that happen in geology that also happen in real life, but that don't happen, that aren't relevant to chemistry or whatever. So for instance, when you drop a coffee cup and it breaks, a brittle transformation, or a plastic transformation where something just gently folds. And when he devised tests of those kinds of things and gave them to PhD geoscientists, PhD chemists, and PhDs actually in English literature, and also mental rotation, which is something that does seem relevant to chemistry. What he found is that the chemists were very good at mental rotation, not so good at the geoscience transformations. The geoscientists were good at all of them, like they were good at the rotation too, but it may be also relevant to geoscience. And the English literature professors were not so good. I'm sure they're great at analyzing English literature, but they were not so good on those tests. Now, that invites the question, though, do you just get good because those are the transformations you've had to do for 20 years, or were you good at those when you chose to go into it, and that's why you felt that you were suited to it? And at that sort of very detailed level, I think we just really don't know the answer.
Thanks. I think, yeah, that's absolutely, that makes sense. And then another small question. I mean, you mentioned that it could be also, that there is a advantage of sketching and using all that kind of tasks. Does it matter whether you are sketching digitally or on paper? Because there are some recent studies about sensory motorics involved, and I know that there are developmental researchers in the audience, and therefore, do you think that the material, I mean, paper or tablet, for instance, matters?
Yeah, I mean, this even comes up with like preschoolers and apps as opposed to, concrete blocks and so forth. And people have been trying to do studies to get at this. I think it's complicated because the apps, they take a little time to learn. Some of them are better than others, etc. The embodied cognition prediction would be that you need the real blocks, but that sometimes seems to be true, but not always. I don't think we know for sure about that. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. So we have a question in chat. Could orienteering be an effective club for children for development of spatial thinking skills, as there are maps used? I don't know what is orienteering.
Yeah. Orienteering is great, or just simple. I mean, orienteering is a very serious sport, but even just some direction giving. And yes, I do really think so. I was actually just a week ago, I think, meeting remotely with a doctoral student and his committee in Israel, who is poised to do some work on school children, and it's following a route, and they follow it safely, like they're not going to go off and get lost. but he's actually going to look at that question. In general, I think navigation, both training navigation and the relation of navigation to scientific and mathematical thinking, and et cetera, it has been very much neglected. We've really focused on, as I said, these small scale spatial skills.
Thanks a lot. So, well, are there any other questions or final comments or any thoughts?
Just thank you in chat. Yeah. Okay.
Well,
No, actually, I don't know if we have time. I also have one more question.
Oh, but also there's a new one from someone who asked. Yeah.
Raising hand. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Then I will just.
So Lihat's and then probably Liga that order.
Thanks. Thank you for the wonderful information. I really appreciate it. And a question is about the malleability of the spatial skills. And is there more effect from being a consumer of spatial information or a producer of it? Like, for example, reading maps or creating maps?
Right. Reading or making maps? Yeah. I mean, I think you need to read them before you can really make them. Is my only idea there. I mean, you can ask people to draw maps who don't very well know how to read maps. I mean, they've been exposed to maps, but they haven't used them much. They often draw really bad maps, and they know it. Like, we've done that in our lab, and they, you know, I don't know, they don't draw to scale. They say, well, you know, really I wanted that there, but I didn't put it there, but now I don't know where it goes. And map making is hard. So I think reading probably comes first. Which is not to say you shouldn't go on to making. Being active is probably good too. It's just one of the things I was trying to get across is the importance of sequencing. You can't do the hard thing before you did the easier thing. And Liga had one more question, and then I'll probably have to get off, actually.
Okay, then I will go on with my question. There are nowadays it's possible to do training on virtual environment, and there could be also done the spatial skills in large scale training. And in what level that could be, in your view, appropriate for learning these large scale skills, to do it through virtual reality, let's say?
Yeah, I don't think we know well how to train the large scale spatial skills. Teru Ishikawa has a recent paper where he tried, and he got some effects, but they weren't very big. But not a lot of people have tried. So yeah, no, I keep emphasizing people need to work on this.
Thanks.
Okay, so I think, well, there is still
Do computer games improve spatial skills? Well, yes, if they're spatial. Yeah, the one that people have done the most research on is Tetris, and that, including me, absolutely does. Not the ones where you just shoot people, though.
Well, probably there are more humor-friendly perspective-taking games than those.
Right.
Well, no, thank you so much. This was really awesome a closing plenary keynote, and we are all really thankful to you. And we hope to see you at some point this year in Riga. And thank you so much. This was really, really great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for inviting me. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.